Be seated. Back on the record in 14-1432, Mr. Jones does appear in custody. He's represented by Ms. Smith and Mr. Colvin. Mr. Rubenstein and Mr. Wade are both here for the people. And we're outside the presence of our jury. Are we ready for the jury to return, Mr. Rubenstein?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Colvin?
Yes, sir.
All right, thanks. I'll go ahead and call for him. Thank you. Please be seated. For the record, our jury has joined us back in the courtroom, and you can continue whenever you're ready, Mr. Colvin. Just for the record, Investigator Norcross is still on the stand, and she's under oath. Thank you. You're welcome.
Investigator, contained in the records related to Mr. Jones, there are cell phone records, right?
Yes?
Okay. And the cell phone records just look like a list of data compilation type deal, is that right?
Yes.
And
Depending on which records, but yes.
And during the break, I showed you some that you recognized, is that fair?
Yes?
Okay. I'm going to continue to publish with permission, Judge.
Yes, thank you for asking.
Credential. Okay. Now, that, we're not reading anything yet, okay?
Okay.
We're just identifying. This is what a page of cell phone records looks like, right?
Concerning that company, yes.
Yes. Okay. Now, we talked before about, during the PowerPoint that I put together. You
Yes.
with me? We talked before about how the idea of obsession was something that could be of interest to the finder of fact in this case, right?
Yes?
Obsession lends itself possibly to motive, right?
Yes?
Okay.
Yes?
Law enforcement, this is not news to you, law enforcement is well aware of these concepts, right?
Yes?
Okay. In fact, more than being aware of it, law enforcement actually asked you, other law enforcement actually asked you to look at the records of Mr. Jones, correct?
Yes, sorry.
And one of the things specifically, you okay?
I am.
Yes. One of the things specifically we're looking at was the history of Mr. Jones' contacts with Model Inc., right?
Correct?
Now, that may or may not be relevant. You didn't know at the time you began investigating this, right?
Correct?
But it's certainly something you want to know. If Mr. Jones is blowing up the Models Inc. phone like Mr. Corvuzzo was, that could be really important, right?
Could be, yes.
Okay. In fact, in reviewing the records, well, let me back up one second. What time frame did you get records for?
The entire month of June and parts of July for Mr. Jones? Yes, and I think that was pretty standard across the board.
In fact, the records you got for everybody that you requested at least was from June 1st through like July 2nd or July 9th. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. At least on the record you ordered. You didn't order for anybody before May, right?
Correct.
Okay? And at least for the records you ordered, you didn't order for anybody after August, correct?
Correct.
Pardon me?
Correct.
Okay. All right. So this is a page of Mr. Jones' records, right?
Yes.
And I'm going to zoom in so we can see, or maybe I'm not. Saw me coming. There we go. Now, continuing permission real quick?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Sir.
You're welcome.
So I just want to orient us a little bit here. So on these records, the phone, each line's just numbered, right?
Correct.
And that's just the order they're on the chart, right?
Correct. Chronological, I believe.
Okay. And then, so we have dates, and the dates tell us something, right? That's
Date of the call,
And then we got the phone number, right?
date and time of the call, and then we have the phone number, yes.
Okay. And so using these records, you can figure out who's calling who, and if you know who the other phone number belongs to, then you actually know at least the owner of the phone, right?
Correct.
Okay. Now you identified in going through these records, phone calls to Models Inc. We've already talked about that, right?
Correct?
These records I just showed you were for June 1st, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, now. Is that big enough you can read it?
Yes.
All right. So June 1st goes from the number 1 down through and including number 7, is that right?
Correct?
Those are all the phone calls on Mr. Jones' personal cell, right?
Correct?
So because the phone records are maintained by the phone company, there's no evidence you're aware of this phone was used for anything other than the phone calls on numbers 1 through 7 on June 1st, right?
Correct.
Okay. And on June 1st, there is a phone call to Models Inc. Is that correct?
Correct?
And that's the one highlighted in yellow, right?
Correct?
And there are other phone calls, obviously. The first one in green, do you recognize that phone number?
Yes.
Who is that to?
I don't remember which of the young ladies. There's either Crystal or I believe a Tabor.
Crystal Tabor is an individual that you are familiar with from the investigation in this case. Is that correct?
Yes.
Not only is she a young lady, she is also a prostitute, known to be a prostitute to law enforcement. Is that correct?
Correct?
Okay. Let's see. So Ms. Tabor is the first 2 phone calls that day, right?
Yes.
And then the 985-1428 number. So that would be number 5. You recognize that phone number?
Yes.
And who's that to?
Can I look at something to make sure I give you the right name? I know I have it. It's to a company by the name of Alexia's Massage.
And Alexia's Massage is a phone number that you're familiar with because it was seized by law enforcement out of Mr. Jones' toolbox when they searched Bob Scott RP. Is that correct?
That may be correct, but that's not how I know what that number was from,
Oh.
I apologize. because it's listed in the newspaper.
Oh.
That's where I got the information from.
All right. Purple, that's in fact Mr. Jones' work, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. Now, on the 1st, these phone calls start at 9:53 and they go to 11 o'clock, so just about an hour, is that right?
Correct.
All of the work number is work, right?
Correct.
But everything else except for this one, number 6, which we don't have highlighted, is to someone that is engaged in massages at least. And some of them we know are actually prostitutes, correct?
Correct?
This number 6, the unhighlighted one, you don't know who that number belongs to, is that correct?
Can I check my records?
Please.
Correct, because it was disconnected at the time I tried.
Okay. So we don't know who it belonged to, but we know it is a number that was dialed in the middle of an hour where 5 other massage/prostitutes were being contacted. Is that right?
Correct?
And out of all those phone calls to massage/prostitutes, only one of them was to Models Inc. Would you agree?
Yes.
Okay. And it was one of several. Fair enough?
One of several that day? Yes.
Okay.
Is that what you meant?
I'm going to transition now to June 19th. Is this in fact the cell phone records that contain June 19th's phone calls? Let me go down here so you can
I
see.
think there was one at the bottom.
There's one, right?
Correct?
Okay. And then, I'm looking at slide June 19th, second. So again, June 19th down to the 20th, is that correct?
Correct.
Is that too small for you?
No, I can see it. Thank you.
Just to orient the jury. So one of June 19th was on the page before. June 20th goes down there. We're looking at June 19th, right?
Okay, yes?
Between June 1st and June 19th, you didn't identify any phone calls to Models Inc., correct?
Correct?
On June 19th, that's the next time you identify a phone call to Models Inc., correct?
Correct?
So we're going to start with that one all by itself. First phone call of the day that day, 9:41 in the morning. Who's that phone call to?
May I refer to my records?
Please do.
That's to Crystal Tabor.
Okay.
It's a different number.
Right. Let's clarify that real quick. Crystal actually has 2 different phones, right?
Yes, or maybe more. I don't know.
Okay. But you identified 2 numbers that you figured out Crystal Tabor owned.
Correct.
Is that fair?
Correct?
Okay. So when we refer to Crystal Tabor, the numbers don't always match, right?
Correct.
All right. First phone call of the day is to Crystal Tabor, known prostitute. Next, we're going to go to the rest of June 19th. So now I'm going to slide June 19-4. Now, that first phone call was at 9, what was it? Do you remember?
9:41, sir.
Okay. Again, we got a bunch of phone calls in a fairly short period of time. So 9:41's on this slide, that's not on this screen. And the phone calls go down to 10:09 on that day, correct?
Correct?
So a little bit over an hour, right?
No, a little under an hour.
Oh, thank you, appreciate that. Actually, quite a bit of.
Like about 15 or 20 minutes.
Okay. My math is so good. Second phone call that day is to who?
Ms. Tabor,
Third phone call that day is to who?
Double A Massage Service.
Next phone call?
Ms. Tabor,
Next phone call?
Alexia's Massage.
And then we've got 2 phone calls to Models Inc., right?
Correct?
And then we've got who?
The Double A Massage again.
Okay. Double A Massage is associated with a lady by the name of Gail LaPena, is that correct?
I don't know that I know that, sir.
Okay.
Again, I got it out of the paper.
Do you know if AA Massage was known to employ prostitutes?
I don't know. I know that they advertise to provide adult massages.
Okay. So, it's a fact that this phone was used to call the Models Inc. phone, correct?
Yes?
That is in the context of 20 minutes of calling a bunch of different adult types of service. Fair enough?
Correct?
Okay. And three of the total phone calls were to Ms. Tabor. Only 2 were to Models Inc., right?
Correct, 2 to Models Inc. and then the 2 to the AA, or maybe it was 2 to Alexius. 2 to the AA.
And then 3 to Ms. Tabor. Go to the page before for that.
Oh, I'm sorry, yes, correct.
All right. Now, let's go to June 20th, first slide. I'm not showing you the blank one because it was on the bottom of June. Oh, let me make that bigger. This is actually the same page we were just looking at for June 19th. We're just looking at a different day now, right?
Correct.
Okay. So June 20th, there's only 2 phone calls that day, right?
Correct.
Who's the first phone call to?
Ms. Tabor.
Who's the second phone call to?
Ms. Jones.
All right. So there's only 2 phone calls that day. One of them is to a known prostitute, but it's obviously not Models Inc., right?
Correct?
Just to be clear, you have no indication from your investigation Crystal Tabor worked for Models Inc., do you?
No.
Okay. Now, some days, there's no phone calls to escort services, right?
Correct?
For example, well, let's pull that one back up. June 21st, so that's right below our red line.
Correct?
June 21st is 2 entries, right?
Yes, sir?
Neither of those entries are associated with anyone involved in massages or adult escort services or any of that stuff, right?
Correct?
Okay. So some days there's nothing to anybody, right?
Correct?
Okay. Let's go to June 23rd. Again, Crystal Tabor, right?
Correct?
Mrs. Jones, right?
Correct, sir?
Okay. Nothing for Models Inc. here, right?
Correct?
There's a pattern of Mr. Jones contacting adult massage types, you know, prostitutes or adult escort stuff. Would you agree?
Yes, sir?
Okay. That pattern, we're seeing it pretty clearly by this point, right?
Yes, sir?
And you certainly saw it during the course of your investigation, right?
Yes, sir?
It is equally obvious that he's calling other people more than he's calling Models Inc. Would you agree?
Yes, sir?
By far, the prostitute he called more than anybody else in all the records you obtained was Crystal Tabor.
Correct, sir?
Okay. I'm going to go to June 24th. Okay, so now we're at the bottom here. We've got the last 2 phone calls on that page, right? I'm sorry, did you see it? Did I see fast?
I think I understand what you're saying, yes?
Okay. I'm just trying to orient us. I'm not putting up colors yet, okay?
Okay.
And then several phone calls at the top of this page, right?
On the 24th, yes.
Okay. Now, let's break these out. On June 24th, 589-1279, that's that number we've seen before, right?
Correct, Ms. Tabor?
Ms. Tabor. The number before that one on the 24th is what?
Mr. Jones has an incoming call.
Okay. Do we know who that's from?
It looks like he's checking his voicemail or something. That's his number.
Okay. So, that's unrelated, presumably, we don't really know. But it's certainly not to an escort service, right?
Correct?
All right. So other than that voicemail check, Day starts out calling Miss Tabor.
Yes?
Now, 589-1279, that's Miss Tabor, right?
Correct?
And then the item 92, the one that starts with 92,
Okay.
270-0638, who's that?
Ms. Tabor?
Okay. And then Miss Jones calls, that's the red line, right?
Yes, before that, yes.
Yes. So between 9:02 and 9:07, there's another call that's not highlighted, right?
Correct?
But in that 5-minute period, there's another phone call made to a number that you found was disconnected, right?
On the, are you talking about the line number 91?
Yeah.
No, that's the voicemail.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm looking at the wrong thing. All right. So contacting Ms. Tabor is all that's happening on this day besides a phone call from Ms. Jones, right?
Correct.
No Models Inc. phone calls.
Correct?
We're almost done. I'm not going to belabor this much longer. But June 25th, that's an important day because that's a phone call to Models Inc. Is that right?
Correct?
Is that big enough that you can see it?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, June 25th, you realize that day had some significance in the course of the investigation. Is that fair?
Yes?
Okay. A thing that was significant about it, there were several, but a thing was, this is the day that Mr. Jones' cell phone's calling Model Inc., right?
Correct?
And there's 2 phone calls to Models Inc. that day, correct?
Correct?
Now, the day starts out with phone calls to Crystal Tabor, is that right?
Correct?
And 270-0638?
Those are both the 270 and the 589 are Ms. Tabor's numbers.
So there's 3 phone calls to Ms. Tabor,
Correct?
There's 2 to Models Inc. There's another one to Crystal Tabor, right?
Correct?
And then 201-0482, who's that?
That's a massage service that I cross-referenced that number from a number found in a toolbox.
Okay? So we're back to calling other massage services.
Correct?
Who's 361-6101?
That one was the disconnect that I think you were talking about earlier.
Yes, thank you. So you tried to figure out this phone number, phone's disconnected when you go to search it out, right?
Correct?
And it's in the middle of, from 1029 to 1046, calling different massage people and adult things, right?
Yes?
433-1626?
Correct?
Who's that?
Deborah Jameson?
Jameson?
Yes, Jameson?
She advertises as a massage person, is that correct?
Correct?
Again, I'm just trying to orient us. So now we've gone to the next page of the records from what we were just looking at. So June 25th is the top entries, is that correct?
Correct?
So we ended previously at what time?
10:46 p.m.?
So now we're at 10:48 in the morning, correct?
Not in the morning?
I'm sorry, 10:48 in the evening, right?
Correct?
We do have a phone call. Whoops. I got the wrong one. I'm sorry. And we're back to 270-0638.
Ms. Tabor.
Crystal Tabor.
Yes, sir.
Who's the 778-9321, you know?
Both that one and the 260 were disconnected.
Okay. So in the course of multiple calls to known massage type folk, we've got a couple of disconnects, right?
Correct?
So how many phone calls are made to massage type folks that day?
On the 25th?
How many separate calls?
Nine.
Huh?
9.
And of those, 2 are to Models Inc., right?
Correct?
How many total phone calls to Models Inc. did you find on Mr. Jones' personal phone?
I want to say 8, but let me double check. Yes, 8. 8?
How many total phone calls to massage type folks did you find? I won't make you count them. It's a lot, right?
I think it's around 58 total.
Okay. And by far, Crystal Tabor's the most.
Yes.
There's many days where Crystal is called and/or other massage people, and Models Inc.'s not called, right?
Correct?
Now, the track phone, it only called Models Inc., right?
Correct?
The usage of his personal phone to call massage type folk substantially increased once his wife left town and was in Atlanta, Georgia, correct?
Correct?
Before his wife's out of town, he doesn't call massage type people every day, right?
Not every day, no.
Okay? And while she's gone, he doesn't call them every day, right?
Correct.
But there's a lot more calls to massage type folks when she's out of town.
I can count if you want me to compare.
Well, do you disagree? Let's start.
I think they're over between on June 7th, there are between June 7th and like June 9th, there's probably 10 plus calls.
Hmm?
There's, and then there's probably 7 calls between the 9th and the 13th. So compare that to when she's out of town, and the 19th. But when she's out of town, so on the 25th. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Oops. So there's 14 during the week she's out of town.
Okay.
So,
And previously, there's a spike on a day.
couple days, yeah?
Spike. She's out of town. We got a bunch going on that week, right?
Correct.
All right. And like we talked about before, when you're engaged in this type of work, it makes sense to have a phone separate from the phone you normally use, right?
Yes, some people do, some people don't. Yes.
Well, Ms. Bergfield did, right?
Yes, yes. And I know from talking with people who work in the business, they often have multiple phones.
Now, one thing about the track phone I think is important to be clear on. The track phone isn't used to call Models Inc. after June 30th. Is that right?
Correct.
Now, after June 30th, well, Elaine Jones gets home on June 30th, is that right?
The afternoon, I believe, yes.
Okay. So the track phone's not being used after Elaine gets home, right?
Correct?
And you participated in an interrogation of Mr. Jones, is that right?
I did.
When was that?
On July 5th?
Okay? And between June 30th and July 5th, your investigation indicated Elaine Jones was home that whole time, right?
Yes, to the best of my understanding, yes.
Okay. And when you interrogate Mr. Jones, it's clear you guys are interested in his activities with prostitutes at that point, right?
Yes?
So just to summarize a couple of things, in your review of Ms. Bergfeld's work phone records, so the Models Inc. phone, you
Okay.
with me?
Yes?
235 different phone numbers that called that number between June 1st and July 2nd, right?
Can I check a report real quick? You're
Certainly.
going to ask me. I don't remember the exact number, I apologize.
I have it as 20408,
I'm sorry, say that again?
February 4th, 2008.
Tell me the phones again that you're talking about.
Yes, sir. We're talking about the Models Inc. phone.
I know there's, okay, and I'm sorry, your number was?
235.
Correct, sir.
Okay. And so that's page after page after page of records like we just looked at, right?
The records are similar, they're not the same kind, but
It's a
yes.
different company, but
Yes, yes,
they're not a lot bigger font, fair to say.
fair to say.
Okay. And there's 235 different phone numbers on those records that you got, right?
Correct.
And the records we're talking about in the context of Ms. Bergfield are June 1st to July 2nd, right?
Correct,
So that's in a month on that phone.
correct.
You did not track down all of the phone numbers on that phone, correct?
I did not.
Maybe if your investigation and the prosecution's investigation last night pans out, you track down all the phone numbers on June 28th. Is that true? Or
No, there are some calls on her, are you talking about on her work phone?
Yeah.
No, there are some calls into her that she did not return that I did not track down.
Okay. So even if the investigation you did last night pans out, we still don't know all the numbers on the June 28th work phone record.
That called her? No, correct.
But beyond June 28th, there's a lot of numbers that you still don't know. Would you agree?
Yes, sir.
Okay. In fact, let me show you slide 16 here. I'm going to go down. Continuing.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Didn't do that right. Let's pretend this top part's not here yet. The last three here, these are all unknown numbers that you don't know of, unless one of them you may have figured out last night, I don't know. But these are all unknown phone numbers that you and law enforcement haven't been able to identify, is that correct?
I don't know.
Well,
I can try to dig out the information, maybe in some reports, I don't know.
we might be able to clean it up easier from
Okay.
another witness. You're aware of the fact that Investigator Street did search warrants for a bunch of phone numbers, right?
Yes, after the fact.
Right.
And I didn't have anything to do with those, so
No,
I apologize.
understand.
Okay.
You didn't do that, but he was still looking for phone numbers in 2013 that you hadn't been able to run down, right?
That I had not run down, yes.
Okay. So we're gonna come back and clean these up later?
Okay.
But you agree with me, there's a bunch of phone numbers on these records that you don't know who they belong to?
Yes, sir.
Okay. There are some specific people whose records you do not have, is that correct?
Correct?
And those include Stephen Heald, right?
Correct?
Those include Jose Tavera, correct?
Correct?
There's a phone that was used by Mr. Coraluzzo, owned by another person named Tracy Adamson. You don't have that phone records, correct?
Right, that's the one that wasn't activated till it was out of state, correct? Is that the one you're talking about?
Well, there's two phones, I think. Tracy Adamson had a cell phone, right?
Yes, yes, she did.
You never got those records, right?
Correct.
And then there's a phone, a track phone, that is purchased by George Coraluzzo. You determined that was activated in New Jersey, is that right?
Correct.
You never got the phone records for that phone, is that right?
Call logs, no.
Mr. Dixon, he had a second phone. We never got the records on that, did we?
No.
Mr. Livingston, we don't have any records on Mr. Livingston's cell phone, is that right?
I don't have any information that he had one.
And we talked about that before. You never determined that he had a cell phone. The way that we determine if somebody has a cell phone is we go ask them, right?
Correct.
So you asked Mr. Livingston, do you have a cell phone?
I don't believe I did, but I believe somebody did.
Law enforcement.
Correct?
Right?
Correct?
And he said no.
Correct. I knew he used the motel. He told us he used the motel phone
Okay.
to call her.
The fact that he says he doesn't have a cell phone is the end of the investigation into Mr. Livingston having a cell phone. Isn't that correct?
Yes?
Okay. There's unknown phone numbers here. You don't know if one of those unknown phone numbers belonged to a cell phone Mr. Livingston either owned or had access to.
I don't know that.
Okay. And obviously, nobody does, right?
I don't know that. I mean, I don't,
But there's no way for, certainly, I can't prove he did because we don't know how many records on any of these.
right, I don't have any information he had a cell phone, sir.
How long was that Walmart track phone activated for?
Days, sir, I know that. I'll give you an exact time here in just a second. I think June 28th until, no, I'm sorry, June 27th. It got purchased and then eventually purchased on the 26th, activated on the 27th, and then it was ended on the 6th of July.
6th of July?
Yes.
Can I have 1 second, please?
Yes, sir.
Show under page 766. Now, before I show you this, July 6th would be in close proximity to the disappearance of Miss Jones, right?
Yes?
And July 6th would be,
I'm sorry, did you say disappearance of Miss Jones?
I
Oh, I'm
did.
sorry.
I confused all three. The disappearance of Miss Burkville.
Yes.
Okay. And July 6th would be the day after you interrogated him, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. I'm showing you a report, it's page 766 of Discovery. If I get you to read the first, silently, read the first sentence of the second paragraph.
Just the first one?
Well, you can read the whole thing if you want.
Okay.
In fact, you called them, and there's some confusion as to the date the phone actually stopped working, isn't that right?
Correct. The records say the 6th
But,
that it was forwarded, but the
Right.
company said the 13th.
okay, well, the company says on the 13th it's still active. It doesn't actually say when they deactivated it, right?
Correct. The records say they deactivated it at one time. They say it was still active.
And when you research that further, the deactivation date possibly was from a different customer, right?
Correct.
So the reality is, as far as you knew, at least on July 13th, TracFone thinks it's an active phone, right?
Correct.
And there's reason to think that July 6th on the records is actually related to a different customer using that phone, correct?
I thought the deactivation that they were talking about with a different customer was possibly before that or something. I
Right.
don't recall exactly. It was before any of that, before this phone number. When you buy a phone, they recycle phone numbers. So I think the description, if I'm remembering correctly, was the deactivation initially that they talked about may have been with some other customer before it was repurchased and reused.
Okay. So at a minimum, the TracFone people think the phone's active on July 13th. They probably would be the ones that would be most important if you want to use that phone. Would you agree?
I'm sorry, say that again?
If you want to use the TracFone, it's probably
Yes.
more important that TracFone thinks the
Oh.
phone's active.
I see what you're
than
saying.
you, Right?
Right.
And we don't know when that phone deactivated according to TracFone, do we?
Correct.
Can I have a second, Judge? I apologize.
No worries, thank you.
The phone number for, I'm sorry, Judge, can I have one more?
You're fine, thank you.
It takes a village. This second phone that we didn't get the records for, you know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
Do you know that phone number?
No, I don't.
Would it sound correct if I told you it was 970-778-0025?
Yeah, now that you mention it, because it was a number off or something, yes.
Right. And the reason we can remember that is because Ms. Paige Bergfeld's record, her phone was 778-0024.
Correct.
The only difference between them is the last.
The last digit, correct.
With that, we have nothing further. Thank you.
Mr. Rubenstein, whenever you're ready, thanks. You're welcome.
You want her to? Sorry.
Morning again, ma'am.
Good morning.
So I want to start with the TracFone deactivation. We'll come back to the TracFone and other issues, but the concept of deactivating a TracFone is, what does that mean, to deactivate a TracFone?
It means someone's not using it anymore. I mean, that You can do it with any cell phone. You have a cell phone, you choose not to have that cell phone anymore.
So you contact the company and say.
Or on
I'm
track
not-
phones, I think you can do it through the phone. I'm not using this phone anymore. And you turn it off, basically.
Okay, so let's suppose you decide to throw it in a river. Have you deactivated it, or did you just stop using it?
Yeah, you just stop using it.
Okay, so the date of deactivation really doesn't necessarily mean anything. As far as, I mean, that's the date that it can't be used, not the
Right.
date that somebody opted to throw it away.
Correct?
Okay. So, Mr. Colvin talked to you about, Ms. Watson, I'm wondering if you can publish Exhibit 311 with the court's permission.
Okay, Mr. Colvin,
Objection, Judge.
that's fine, you can proceed, thank you.
He talked to you about how you presented your PowerPoint and whether or not it was, I think he used the word bolstering, presentation yesterday, bolstering the case, I think was the phrase he used. Ms. Watson, I'm wondering if you can put up slide 6 first. Now, you talked about, yesterday, you talked about things going to voicemail, and then you said that they were likely voicemail, and Mr. Colvin challenged you on whether or not you, in your presentation, indicated that it didn't necessarily go to voicemail, indicating that you hadn't testified to that. Is this the slide that we were showing yesterday?
Yes?
Can I have you look at the 12:45 call? Now,
Okay.
you listed that as possible voicemail,
Correct?
meaning you don't know, but based on your expert opinion, it was possibly a voicemail.
Correct?
Okay. Ms. Watson, can I look at slide 7? 1306 call, same thing?
Yes, sir?
Slide 13, Ms. Watson? $19.59 call,
Yes, sir?
slide 14. 2031 call,
Yes, sir?
slide 15. 2037 call.
Yes?
In your estimation, does this presentation much less highlight any one particular person than the presentation Mr. Colvin was showing you with, I think, with Mr. Coraluzzo's list?
Okay, I'm sorry, ask the question again.
Does this presentation much less highlight any one particular person and just show what happened?
This is just showing the chronological order of all the calls of these people.
Now, on his presentation, he talked about the 2013 call. Ms. Watson, can I have you back up? The 2013 call, Bergfeld calls Coraluzzo, and your presentation doesn't have the number of seconds, but we talked yesterday about how long that call was, and that was your interpretation from that a call possibly occurred.
Yes, sir?
So I want to make sure I'm understanding your testimony, because when Mr. Colvin was asking you, he used the phrase that she spoke to Mr. Coraluzzo. Is that your testimony? That she spoke to Mr. Coraluzzo?
It's about 131 seconds, my understanding, and that's more likely a conversation, yes.
And I understand that part of it. What I'm misunderstanding is the part where it involves Mr. Coraluzzo. Is it your testimony that she spoke to Mr. Coraluzzo?
I know she calls that number.
Okay.
I
You're
know
aware-
from other information that she may not have spoken to him, but definitely there was a conversation on that phone.
And you're aware, because you've been working on this case and testified in other proceedings, that there's conflicting information about whether he was there. then.
Correct, and that's a home phone. Correct.
And so the fact of that being on there was this to fairly and accurately represent all of the calls, regardless of who, and the colors indicating which person that call was a result of.
Correct.
You have no information, for example, that Ms. Zarzosa was trying to get a hold of Ms. Bergfeld?
Correct.
Okay. One of the things that Mr. Colvin talked to you about is your interpretation of possible or likely voice messages based on your knowledge of how long it takes to connect. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Remember he's talking about that? And he was asking you if you have the same experience that everybody else has who makes a phone call. You actually do bring something else to the table on that, right?
Well, I mean, I've spent a lot of time looking at phone records, and I've talked to people concerning those phone records, and that's all of that put together, and trying to time some phone calls to see how long it takes. All of that together gives me that estimation of 30 seconds.
Okay. So would it be your impression that most people have, in addition to, of course, using phones, have then gotten the phone logs to compare how long that phone call took to how long they thought it took?
No. I'll talk to people, and if they have, sometimes you talk to people and they say, gosh, I think I called and I remember just leaving a message and it's 20 seconds, as an example. So therefore, that is a confirmation that, yeah, you leave a message at about that amount, and it takes a little bit longer if you're going to actually talk to somebody.
So you'll then go look at the records to see how long, based on somebody's description, something actually took.
Right, because many phone companies give you seconds. A few of them don't, but most of them do. And people don't see that in their, when you get a phone bill.
So there was some discussion about what phone records you did or didn't get, and specifically about whether or not there were some numbers that you didn't know. Mr. Coleman, I'm wondering if I can borrow your slide that you had of the different phone numbers that she...
Yes, but I don't know how to give it to you without that machine. I'm sorry, you want slide, the last slide?
Whichever slide has the list of records that she didn't get.
Right. Correct.
Thank you. So I want to talk to you a little bit about these records and why you didn't get them.
Okay?
Let's start with Mr. Heald. Why didn't you get Mr. Heald's records?
Because I personally went down and spoke with his wife and interrupted her at work while he was being spoken to at the sheriff's office. And she talked about,
Objection, hearsay.
Mr. Rubenstein.
I think it's admissible at this point to explain why she didn't do, I mean, she's been criticized for her investigation on that. I think it can be offered not for the truth of the matter asserted, but to explain why she didn't do that, since that was the specific purpose the defense counsel had gone into it with her on cross.
The objection's overruled. The jury's only to consider the statements of Mr. Heald's, or that are attributed to Mrs. Heald, I guess we'll say at this point. Not for the truth of what she said, but just as to why this witness did or didn't do what she did next. It's for that limited purpose only. Thank you. You can proceed.
and I learned that Ms. Heald had been with Mr. Heald during the time of Ms. Bergfeld's disappearance.
Were those records also a home phone?
I believe they had cell phones also, I don't recall.
But either way, you had ruled him out as being somebody who could have done this for other reasons than the phone records.
Correct.
Phone records are a tool, of course, but they don't tell you everything. Is that right?
Correct.
How about Mr. Tavera?
I personally didn't know much about his involvement to start with, because I didn't handle much of that particular angle, and I don't have any record of him calling Ms. Bergfeld at all.
Is it accurate to say the information you have is that Mr. Tavera has no connection to Ms. Bergfeld, only a connection to Mr. Coraluzzo?
Correct.
Okay, so getting his records, if he's friends with Mr. Coraluzzo, he may be calling Mr. Coraluzzo, which doesn't tell you anything about this.
Correct.
Okay. Mr. Coraluzzo's track phone?
That Mr. Coraluzzo, I learned through other investigators that there wasn't a question as to whether or not Mr. Coraluzzo had tried to contact Ms. Bergfeld, and we knew that from phone records also. That track phone was not even activated until he was out of state, and it's not included in her phone records. And he was out of state before a car fire.
Okay, so just to make sure the jury's understanding the chronology, the track phone was not activated until after her disappearance,
Correct?
and when it was activated in New Jersey, and he was in New Jersey at the time of the car fire.
Correct.
So you already knew Mr. Coraluzzo had called Ms. Bergfeld from her records,
Correct?
and that this track phone, based on time of when it was activated, could have had nothing to do with the disappearance because it happened later.
Correct.
Is that all accurate?
Correct?
Okay. And Ms. Adamson's phone, the information you have is that Mr. Coraluzzo used Ms.
Objection to counsel testifying.
This is a question. I'm starting to ask a question, I think.
Yeah, the objection is sustained. The way that I understand it to be at this point, it was, I think you can rephrase it
Sure.
to make certain that it's admissible anyway. Thank you.
What is the information you have about Mr. Coraluzzo using Ms. Adamson's phone?
I was aware that investigators confirmed that information through her,
Okay.
and
You
that there was
also
one
have-
phone call.
I'm sorry?
And there's one phone call,
And that's a phone call you know about because of what?
because it's in Ms. Bergfeld's records.
Okay, so to the extent you cared about that phone, you have records that show that, is that accurate?
Correct?
Okay. Mr. Dixon's second phone?
My reason for getting Mr. Dixon's phone records were it was my understanding the investigation had confirmed he was in Pennsylvania at the time of her disappearance. I was strictly getting those records to show when he left Pennsylvania and arrived in Colorado, and to confirm what everyone else was saying.
Okay. Mr. Livingston's personal cell, I think you already addressed the concept that you don't have any information that he had one.
Correct.
What was the information you have about him using phones?
He said well, my understanding is he used the Motel 6 phone. He used motel phones when he was calling for escort services.
As well as telling you he didn't have a phone, the records you have show that he was...
Correct. Using the Motel 6 phone.
Okay. Now, those unknown numbers appear in the records. In
I
Ms.
believe you.
Bergfeld's records?
I believe you.
No, I'm asking. Are
I would
those
have to
ones-
go through the reports.
Okay, but I think, and Mr. Colvin would be the one to answer this probably, but I think that this is a list of the ones you talked about yesterday.
I can check. I
Well-
don't have them memorized, so I apologize.
Why don't we go about it this way? Yesterday, you talked about some numbers that were unknown.
Correct.
Ignoring whether or not those are the particular numbers, there are some numbers in her records on June 28th that were unknown, both on her Model Sync phone and on her personal cell. Is that correct?
Correct.
And we narrowed down, this is a question to you from your understanding of what we talked about yesterday. Is it true that we narrowed down yesterday that none of those were from the time frame of when she was leaving Eagle until her disappearance, with the exception of one that you investigated last night?
Correct. And
And
that's
that-
on her personal cell phone.
That one on her personal cell phone?
Correct.
Okay, so there were none on the Models Inc. and just one on the personal cell that you think you're following up on?
Yes.
Okay. Can you tell me, from Mr. Jones' personal cell phone records, how many escorts does he call on June 28th of 2007?
And I'm sorry, what was the date, the 28th of June?
June 28th of 2007.
None,
What about June 29th of 2007?
none. He doesn't make any calls on June 29th.
Okay. And you talked about the idea that sometimes in this business, people have multiple phones.
Yes, or change them frequently.
And you were referring to Miss Bergfeld, who had a personal cell, or I call it a personal cell, but she had her other businesses, right? Not the
Correct.
Models Inc. business
Correct.
on that phone, and also made personal calls. But then she had her one cell phone number, which from at least listening to the voice messages, would you agree that it sounds like that's pretty much Models Inc.? That's what's happening on that phone?
Yes,
Okay. And Mr. Colvin also talked to you about the idea that sometimes people, customers, would also possibly use a phone intimating that maybe Mr. Jones was doing that with the track phone.
yes.
Okay, so can I ask you, chronologically, at the point he purchased the track phone, did he stop using his personal phone to call escorts?
No,
He kept using his personal phone?
yes.
Can you tell me, what are the different escorts that he was calling from his personal phone? You mentioned Deborah Jameson, Crystal Tabor. Who are the others?
You have Alexia's Massage. You have Massage Service, is what it's called in the paper. You have Ms. Tabor, you have Ms. Barker. You have AA Massage Services, Alexia's Massage Service. Ms. Jameson. And that's it. Did I say Barker?
You did.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, that's it.
Okay. So, one of the things that's difficult about phone records is you can figure out what occurred, but you can't figure out why it occurred. Is that accurate?
Concerning phone calls?
Yeah.
Yes,
You-
yes.
You can be aware that a call happened, but why particular people are called, you can't get that from the records.
Correct. You have to talk to people.
And Mr. Colvin talked to you about that, about the idea that he's calling Models Inc. in the middle of some of these other calls, and sounded like positing or coming up with a theory that Mr. Jones is not necessarily focused on the Models Inc. phone and calling Miss Bergfeld, right?
Yes,
Now, fortunately, there are other ways to learn those things, right?
yes,
One of those other ways would be to interview somebody and ask them.
yes,
And you did that.
yes, I did.
You actually talked to Mr. Jones and discussed that topic.
Yes, I did.
Okay. So you got his explanation as to why.
Yes.
Okay. Can you tell me how many calls on the track phone are to massage service?
0,
How many calls are to Alexi's Massage?
0,
How many calls are to Deborah Jameson?
0,
How many are to Crystal Tabor?
0.
You said Miss Barker. What's Tanya Barker?
Yes.
How many
That's
calls
right.
are to Tanya Barker on the track phone?
0,
And what about AA Massage?
0.
You're aware from the investigation that at the point that Miss Bergfeld disappeared, the defendant's wife was still out of town for another 2 days?
Yes.
You talked about the number of calls being higher at certain times, but certainly spiking when she was out of town?
Yes?
Did I understand your testimony correctly, that at the point from the moment of the last phone call from the Models Inc. phone to the track phone, never again from any of the records did Mr. Jones call any escort on any of his phones until his wife returned, or until possibly after his wife returned? No calls on the 28th, no calls on the 29th.
There's a call on the morning of the 30th.
To escort?
Yes, to Ms. Tabor.
To Miss Tabor.
Yes, at 11:21. And I believe Ms. Jones returned in that afternoon.
And are you aware that that was the time of the Miss Jones? I'm sorry. So from the point that Miss Bergfeld went missing for 2 days, no calls until that call to any escort.
Correct.
Never again a call to Miss Bergfeld's phone at all from the track phone.
Correct?
Never again a call to Miss Bergfeld's phone at all from the personal cell.
Correct.
And then whether it was deactivated on the 6th or the 13th of July, at some point that phone, that second phone that could be used for this service, which it sounds like didn't stop, not with the track phone?
Correct?
Thank you, Your Honor. I have no further questions.
Mr. Colvin, other questions for the witness?
Yes.
Okay, whenever you're ready, thank you.
So, I just want to make sure we're on the same page. The June 30th, he's on the phone with a known prostitute, right?
In the morning, yes.
Now, this is
There's a
af-
call to that, yes.
This is after Ms. Bergfeld's disappeared, right?
Correct?
He's also on the phone with a known prostitute, I think it's on the 3rd, isn't it? Could you look at July 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th? I'll be impressed if you can remember all those numbers.
I see 2 calls on the 4th, sir.
Okay. Who are the calls to on the 4th?
One to Ms. Tabor, one to Ms. Barker.
Okay. So on the 4th, that's the 4th of July. That's a holiday, right?
Yes?
2 phone calls that day, right?
Yes?
1 phone call on the 30th, right?
Yes?
So the use of phone calls to prostitutes has gone way down once Mrs. Jones is back, right?
Yes.
And during the period of time when Mrs. Jones isn't there, he's not calling prostitutes every day, right?
Correct. May I check one more thing?
Yes.
Yes, there's 1 day with no calls to prostitutes.
So, it is a fair statement that when Mrs. Jones is out of town, his calling of prostitutes goes up, but it's not every day, and it goes down when she's gone. Or it
In
goes
July.
down when she's back, right?
Yes, for that part of the month, yes.
But it doesn't end completely, right?
Correct?
And the fact of the matter is, on the track phone, you don't know when it got deactivated, right?
Well, I can tell you the calls stopped on the 20, I tell you the calls stopped.
Well, I know the call stopped.
Okay.
You guys testified
28.
to that a few times now, right?
And I can tell you the records say the 6th, the company said the 13th it was active, whether it was, I don't know.
Okay. But prosecution just asked you about throwing it in a river. Do you have any evidence that it was thrown in the river?
No,
Okay.
I don't know what happened to it.
I mean, the reality is you don't know where that phone is, and as of today, you don't know when it got deactivated for sure, right?
Correct,
What you know is it stopped getting used, right?
correct.
And it stopped getting used around the time Ms. Jones came back, also around, I know this is gonna be the response, also around the time Ms. Burkfield disappeared, right?
Correct,
But that is right before Mrs. Jones gets home, right?
correct.
And the fact of the matter is, by July 5th, you're talking to Mr. Jones in the disappearance and potential murder of Ms. Bergfeld, right?
Yes,
And he's saying, ain't my track phone at that point, right?
correct.
That's why you were talking about the fact that it was suspicious when you were talking to prosecution, right?
I actually have to correct that. I didn't talk to him about the track phone on the 5th of July.
Oh, I'm sorry. That was a different conversation.
Yes, and that, yes, correct.
But the fact remains that he knew you guys were looking at him, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay. And if he had used the track phone to contact Ms. Bergfeld, you guys would have found that really suspicious, right?
I'm sorry, say that again. If he'd used it after I spoke with him?
No. If he used a track phone to call Mrs. Bergfeld, the person you guys are looking at as being disappeared, that'd be suspicious, right?
Yes,
In fact, it is suspicious to you, right?
yes,
So denying using that track phone would make sense if you don't want you guys being suspicious of you.
yes.
All right. The fact of the matter is, you just testified that the entire point of that previous presentation, not the one we did today, but the previous one, was just to fairly, I think the words were fairly and objectively, fair and balanced, something like that. Lay out the facts,
I think it's
right?
I think it's a fair representation of the interaction. I think it's a factual representation, condensed, of those people who, and who was contacting this person who's missing. Yes,
On June 28th.
yes,
And June 28th, if that's the day that something significant happened, then that representation is important, right?
she makes 2,000 calls during the month, and all of her calls stop as of about 9:05, and she doesn't make any other calls. So I do think that's significant.
I
Yes,
understand that that's why it's significant to
Yes.
you. But the fact of the matter is, if she sets up an appointment with the murderer on June 27th, your representation doesn't tell us anything, right? If you assume that the person that killed her talked to her on the 28th, then that's important, right?
I think it's important because I think the totality of the case information supports that, yes.
I understand
Yes.
law enforcement and prosecution have their theory, but that's not the question. The question is, that PowerPoint is important and persuasive if you assume that the murderer called her on the 28th, right?
If you believe that, yes.
And if you don't make that assumption, then that PowerPoint shows nothing more than she stopped talking to people that day, right?
And who she talked to up to that disappearance, yes.
But that's not important unless you assume she talked to the murderer that day, man.
Well, at some point, she was in contact with the person who met her demise.
At some point she was.
Yes.
That's self-evident.
She had to meet up with them, thus to be in person.
That's self-evident. What is not self-evident, and what is in fact an assumption, is she talked by cell phone to the murderer on June 28th. If you don't make that assumption, your PowerPoint doesn't tell us anything.
And I think that's a reasonable, yes, I think that's reasonable.
Okay. There's a bunch of stuff that wasn't collected, none of which is important in your estimation based upon your conversation with prosecution just now, I gather.
Correct?
Okay. So this stuff doesn't matter, but you don't have it, right?
Correct.
And you don't know what it said.
Correct?
And it's hard to know if there's something of value in something that you don't have. Would you at least agree with that?
Yes, unless you're able to verify things through other sources, yes,
Okay, well, that's a yes, but.
maybe.
And the but part means that you don't agree with the yes part, wouldn't you agree? In other words,
Mr. Heald, I believe, because of the way I personally had the conversation with Ms. Heald, I personally was able to determine, and I believe that she had no known reason to know what her husband was doing.
your opinion.
Yes.
I understand.
Okay.
You've made it clear.
Okay.
You think Hill didn't do it. I got it. My question for you is, well, let's do this easy question. Have you ever been wrong in your
Yes,
life?
yes, I have.
Okay. You ever been wrong on something important?
Yes,
Okay.
probably.
Isn't it fair to say that it is possible you could have gone and gotten the cell phone records for Mr. Hill?
I could have, yes.
And you
We
did.
could have, yes, and I did not.
And the fact remains, you don't know what the cell phone records say, right?
Correct.
And you made it very clear. Your opinion that they wouldn't have been helpful, you feel that way strongly, right?
I know when he called her because of her records. I already have that information. So
Not
yes,
answering my question. You feel strongly those records would not have been helpful, right?
correct.
Okay. But the fact is, you don't know that because you haven't seen them.
I don't have them, correct.
And we could have this same conversation for every one of these because you don't have them, right?
Correct?
Nothing.
Mr. Rubenstein. Thank you. You're welcome. You can begin whenever you're ready. Thanks.
Investigator, you testified that Mr. Jones' phone called escorts on the 30th of June?
Yes,
And what were those other dates after that? July,
July 4th, I believe?
was there some date before July 4th? Was it maybe the 3rd as well?
No, July 4th.
Okay, so was there anything between the 30th and the 4th?
No?
Your
Not
fir-
not to an escort service, no.
Not to an escort service, okay. So your contact, your first contact with Mr. Jones was on what day?
My contact with him was on the 5th of July.
Are you aware of any other law enforcement contact with him prior to that on this case?
I don't believe so.
Okay. And you said that when you talked to him on the 5th of July, you didn't talk about the track phone.
Oh, absolutely not.
Why not?
Because he didn't tell me about it. I asked him questions about what he had done and where he had been, and he never mentioned anything. As a matter of fact, I said, do you have any other phones? I got his cell phone number from him. He gave me his cell phone number. He gave me Ms. Jones' cell phone number. I asked if I got his home phone number, asked if they had any others. He didn't give any. I didn't know about it.
Okay. And then it wasn't until later that law enforcement learned who had the track phone. Is that accurate?
Correct?
Okay. So the defendant didn't give you an explanation as to the track phone because he didn't tell you about it and then later denied that he had it. Is that
Correct.
accurate? And then the defense has, through this case, given the explanation that he was trying to have a different phone similar to Ms. Bergfeld for his escort calls.
Judge, I'm going to object.
Is that accurate?
Testifying again. He's also characterizing the defense's statements.
Sorry, we're not picking you up on the microphone.
Judge, I object on the fact that prosecution's testifying again. I also object separately on the independent ground that he's characterizing the defense's statements, which is not correct.
I'll withdraw that, Your Honor.
Okay, it's withdrawn, so I won't rule on the objection. Thank you.
Investigator,
And
I'm
the
gonna
jury's to disregard the DA's comments. Thank you.
I'm going to give you, oh, thank you. I'm going to give you a hypothetical.
Okay?
Hypothetically, if the explanation for having the track phone was so that you could hide from somebody the calls to escorts, would that explanation be borne out by the records you have?
Objection, Judge. The hypothetical is beyond the scope of this witness's expertise, at least what she's been qualified as, and as such a hypothetical is improper.
Mr. Rubenstein.
I think her expertise is in interpreting cell phone records, and she has cell phone records that I believe she could form an opinion as to whether or not that explanation would be borne out by those records.
The objection sustained.
So is it an accurate statement that both before the purchase of the track phone, I'm sorry, all three, before the purchase of the track phone, during the use of the track phone, and after the termination of the track phone, Mr. Jones was using his personal cell phone to call escorts?
Yes.
And that was all prior to law enforcement having any contact with him?
Yes.
Thank you, nothing further.
Mr. Colvin, other questions for the witness?
Yes, thank you, sir. After the track phone's used, calls to the escorts have gone way down.
Yes.
And we don't know when the track phone's deactivated, right?
Correct.
And it is in the media before you guys are interrogating him on the 5th that Ms. Bergfeld's missing, right?
Yes.
Nothing.
Nothing based on that.
All right, is she still under subpoena, and if so, is she released, or?
She is under subpoena, and we will meet her for other issues, including the interview with the defendant, I think, later today.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. You're still under subpoena, but free to go, investigator.
sir.
You're welcome, Mr. Rubenstein. Yes, sir. Feel free to stretch, everybody. Thank you. Floor and time to get back up here. Thank you so much. Please rise for our jury. Our jury has left the courtroom. Anything else for the record, Mr. Colvin?
No, sir.
Mr. Rubenstein?
No, sir.
We'll be in recess until 1 o'clock, please. Thank you.